So Islamic Studies is taught both at the Humanities division at NELC and also at the Divinity School. And if we could maybe just step back a little bit to understand, what is the mission of the Humanities? What's the division of Divinity School? And I'll have, Ahmed El Shamsy respond for Humanities as the chair of NELC, and Yousef Casewit, who is the director of Islamic Studies at the Divinity School, also respond to that. And once we understand kind of the missions, if anybody wants to respond to that or add anything on, then we can kind of understand the relationship of how Islamic Studies is informed by either mission. So, Ahmed.
Yeah, I think maybe the best way of explaining the humanities approach is to think about what it is not. So the natural sciences seek to explain and predict the way things in nature work. The social sciences seek to explain and predict how societies, how groups work. And the humanities starts from the insight that individuals are not governed by the same laws that particles are, but that you have to understand them, that they have motivations and they have particularities, that they are unpredictable in a certain way. And you have to understand them from within their own selves, from within their own cultures, within their own worldviews, philosophies, religions, languages, etc. So in our department, which is called Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, first of all, we begin with an importance of languages as a window into individual cultural experiences in the Near East. So we believe that you have to approach a people and a set of ideas through the languages in which these people think, communicate, write, so that this is something that people need to study as a window into this. And then beyond this, the ability of humans to understand other humans, in the sense that we have that ability to understand ideas, to understand cultures from within, to read their experiences, even though they might have happened thousands of years ago, even though they might be written down by people who we don't share their worldview, we don't share their religion or philosophy with. But that there is a way of approaching this through contextualizing, through understanding the history of people, through understanding their language, through approaching them through their own statements, and that's how we encounter others. And in that sense, the kind of humanities as a mission is also not just simply understanding a specific kind of people, but raising an awareness of how we can relate to people who are other than us, whether have other religions or have lived in other places or in times.
So at the University of Chicago Divinity School, religion is studied from various fields. We have different areas. First of all, we have Islamic Studies is one of 12 areas. We have history of religions, anthropology and sociology of religion, history of Judaism, religions in the Americas, religious ethics, history of Christianity, and so on. And we define Islam on our website. The Islamic Studies program self-defines itself as studying Islam as a textual tradition inscribed in history and particular contexts. But we use different methodologies, and we recognize religion as being expressed through literary, poetic, social, political, intellectual environments. And so we aspire to use literary criticism, hermeneutics, history, sociology, anthropology, and so on to approach the study of Islam. Now, the Divinity School, I'm one of several faculty members who study Islam. My colleague Ali Reza Adustar is an anthropologist primarily. Our dean and also affiliate in Islamic Studies, Jim Robinson, is a specialist in medieval Jewish thought. But in so doing, he's also a specialist in Islamic thought and Islamic philosophy to a certain extent. And so we do I would say we don't have a uniting vision for what it means to study religion in the 21st century that all members of all areas can sit down and agree on. Maybe it's too strongly put, but I might say that the one thing that unites us is the peer-reviewed process. Publishing and engaging peer-reviewed articles and books. Beyond the university walls, of course, the study of Islam, at the University of Chicago, there's the Divinity School, there's NELC, there's history, anthropology, all these other areas, also SALC, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and they also feature specialists and scholars who work on Islam from various angles. Perhaps that's a place to start. I self-define as someone who can help students who come to me read advanced texts in Islamic thought, specifically mysticism, theology, and philosophy. And I also try to help them situate those ideas in a particular historical, political context. And I help them read the primary sources, the manuscripts, and I tell them that I do a few things well, and other faculty members do a few things well as well, and so I identify what each faculty member does well and go to them for that. And the experience of a student at the Divinity School is often shaped by who's present when they're on campus and their interests and how they can situate them in relation to other faculty members. And something cohesive does come out at the end. It's not all, we do have some kind of shared center of methodological sort of, priorities, but I would say that much just to start off, to define what we do at the Divinity School in relation to what you said, Ahmed, about approach to the study of Islam at Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations.
And it's not that we have a perfect division of labor. I mean, it's not that. I mean, you could also work in our department. Right. So there's specific histories why the university teaches in specific schools and departments, and there is very often overlaps. Yeah. I think the justification for the existence of such separate departments in the schools is that you have specific degree programs for specific purposes, but the scholars, the scholarship, also the students, they have conversations across these divisions, and they share or do not share interests, and I think maybe one way of thinking it is these are conversations that are going on. I guess at the Divinity School you have maybe a slightly different set of conversations than we have. There overlaps, obviously our students meet in classes, they meet in workshops. There might be some preoccupations, maybe some comparative preoccupations, let's say, with religions outside of the Near East that you would find in the Divinity School that you would not find with us, or specific maybe theoretical preoccupations in the study of religions that maybe our students don't necessarily participate in. But so you can't clearly separate between these various people interested in Islam at the University of Chicago.
And there's also different histories, very different histories. I mean, the study of Islam at the Divinity School is only started in the early 2000s. I think it's 2006 or so when Michael Sells was hired. He's now retired. And originally the Divinity School was a place where it aspired to train ministers, and it was a seminary. It was the first initial building of the University of Chicago. It's situated in the heart of campus. But in the 60s, when religious studies departments split off from seminaries, the Divinity School did something quite bold at the time, which is keep everything in one building. So we have PhD students in Islamic Studies, we have MA students in Islamic Studies, but we also have MDiv students training in chaplaincy and other, to become chaplains or to work in prisons and hospitals and so on. And then we have AMRS, it's just a 1 year in and out sort of exposure to the study of religion by people, let's say, in foreign service or something. who just need a little bit of exposure to the academic study of religion. And so our history also determines a bit of the color or the overall methodological sort of environment of the Divinity School, and we're not even internally always very aware of it. I discovered the history of the study of Islam at the Divinity School just through committee work and just being socialized into the environment over the last 6 years. I think that's an important point too. NELC is much older in terms of study of Islam. I mean, I don't know when it started, but you have it.
Well, I mean, we changed our name. We changed our name to NELC in the 1960s. Before that, we were the Department of Oriental Studies, which obviously is a kind of tradition of Western kind of Orientalism, which is a study of languages, literatures, and textual traditions. We used to have a Oriental Institute that has just recently been renamed to the Institute for the Study of Ancient Civilizations. Is that it? So the term Oriental has become problematic in certain people's minds, but there is a longer tradition there of studying the Middle East, obviously originally done by people who studied it from afar, who are culturally, religiously, removed from it. This is very far away from the Near East, obviously.
I'm a faculty member in NELC, but also an associate member of Divinity. And students who are applying to the University of Chicago often ask me, it's like, which program should I apply to? Are they the same? If I want to study Islam, which one should I come into? And I tell them, well, whether you come into NELC or the Divinity School, you have access to the other, and you have access to the university's resources throughout, but at the same time there are certain focuses which are different, which you should keep in mind in terms of which program you want to apply to. And this is what both of you, Ahmed and Yousef, have been saying, but just to put it in a slightly different way. As we were discussing earlier this morning, NELC has focuses very much on philology, on language, and has a different kind of center of gravity, which is all around it is the history of Islam, the various literature traditions of the Middle East, Persian and Turkish and all of and Hebrew and all of these various things. The center of gravity in Divinity is religion and comparative religion, I think. So what you're looking at, your neighbors and the other faculty members around you are studying, the history of Judaism or Christianity and so on, as you mentioned. So there's a slightly kind of different focus, can focus in both. It's more focused on comparative religion, on the theory of religion. In Divinity, it's much more focused on literatures and texts and so on, I think, in NELC. And maybe that's a stereotype because anyone can do both. But in terms of the programmatic requirements, those are some classes that are mandated differently in the two different programs, I think.
Can I ask you to maybe all to think a little bit more about this question of the sort of weight of legacy or weight of history of the institution? So for instance, you mentioned that there's the curriculum which was designed by Marshall Hodgson in many ways. Our dear colleague Cornel Fleischer, who passed away recently, came into my office last fall and said, kind of lamenting some of the recent retirements, he said, "I'm now the last Hodgsonian at the University of Chicago." And so, there's obviously the field changes and people change and approaches change, but yet that legacy remains, and there's always at least some demand to kind of negotiate with it, to continue it, to adapt and change. Can you talk a little bit more about how kind of you see your roles in relationship to that legacy and just your experience as it evolves?
So the courses we teach, in a sense, reflect that thinking of basically what he designed this course for which he wrote this three-volume work, The Venture of Islam, and the early period, the middle period, the modern period. We still do that. We don't really teach his work so much anymore. We use a like a mukhtasar / tahdhib of it, Eggert, Vernon Eggert version, which is kind of simplifies it a little bit because his prose was extremely, well, not extremely, but it's not easy. It's not an easy read, The Venture of Islam. So Hodgson's ideas are still, you can still find them, but he's obviously also a child of his own time. These are not timeless truths that he gave us, and there are parts in volume 2, if you read them, about social history or whatever. These are things that are, when he died in his, we talked about age. He died aged 46, I think. There were many things he didn't know, and he wasn't aware of. The field hadn't moved towards, etc., etc. So we can't, we're not kind of blindly upholding a tradition, but rather an approach, an approach in which Islam is not exoticized, but it's understood as part of world history. That's one of the University of Chicago approaches that it really championed in the 1960s and 70s, kind of world history, not just think of history of the West as like the kind of one and all history and everything else being some sort of mythologies that you experience, but that all of it is part of a history, and that in fact for a long time Islamic history had really a central role in kind of dominating kind of central areas of the Eurasian and African landmass. But in that sense, I mean, do we have a single methodological approach? I mean, Tahera teaches literature, I teach thought. We have a variety of scholars of times and places. So we're not. You need all kinds of tools to study an area and a time period that is as rich as the Near East, and so that's something we every generation needs to renew its faculty, and we are in the process of doing that. But I mean, the question I'd like to ask to you, about your experience, particularly in contradistinction to the Divinity School. Sometimes I have students who are taking a course in NELC, and they're kind of not satisfied in the sense that they want to learn some. I mean, very often people of Muslim background or recent converts, that they want to learn about Islam, and kind of our approach for them is too much distance, too theoretical, they want to know, so what should I do, how should I act, etc. And I say, well, that's not the kind of topic that we're dealing with here. It's not constructive theology we are doing. We're not telling you what to do, but we want you to be able to understand the figures, the ideas that we are studying historically. If I say to them, take a course in the Divinity School, is that the solution, or what do you think?
That's a good question. We do have professional constructive theologians at the Divinity School, people like Jean-Luc Marion from the Catholic tradition, who's evolved, let's say, over decades, began as almost like an intellectual historian, and ended up as a thinker, a Catholic thinker. We don't quite have the equivalent of a Marion at the Divinity School, and we don't really have, even as a field, like, let's say, book series devoted to constructive Islamic thought. And I think we're moving toward that slowly. There are people in the field, Martin Nguyen and others, who are very self-consciously trying to define themselves in relation to these, let's say, Catholic constructive thinkers, and we even have some Jewish constructive thinkers to a certain extent at the Divinity School. But that type of student that you're describing may walk in with just expectations that are not like accurately calibrated for the institution. They may find it nourishing to take a class with a constructive theologian proper. And I think the Divinity School could hire someone like that within Islamic studies, because we have precedent for that in other traditions. We don't actually have that. I may myself move in that direction at some point. I don't feel ready to do a move in that direction. I haven't read enough of, let's say, constructive Catholic thought or something to just be able to situate my work in relation to a project like that, or you know, find my own, carve my path in relation to that kind of work.
So just to understand, when you say constructive, can you explain what you mean by that? And also, would you then say that is NELC taking more of a historical lens then to the study of Islam? Like, is that how it's placing itself in relation to the study of Islam?
You can edit out the thinking.
Yeah. Well, it might be
Watching
good
me
to
a minute.
You
know, if you're a young person, I mean, particularly, I guess, if you're a young person in the Western world and you want to educate yourself about your religion, and you say, okay, so where could I go? I go to university, and then you walk, let's say, into Tahera Qutbuddin's class, World Authority on Literature, and then you read something that you think, but hold on a second, that's not Islamic. That's, you know, that can't be right. I mean, that doesn't, work with what I learned about my religion, and it's like that's not her role to do. Her role is, I mean, I project here on you, but her role is to introduce you to the richness of Arabic literature, and not to say, oh, I'm doing a Sunday school, Friday school. It should be Friday school, but it's Sunday. It happens for Muslims as well on Sunday. This is not a Sunday school to teach you what is right and wrong, what is right, correct Islam and incorrect Islam, but this is meant to socialize you into a field of thought and into historical periods, and similarly for me, when I teach a course on whatever, it's law or theology or something else, I'm not giving you the answers for your religious questions, but I think I'm giving you and people who are non-Muslims and people who are whatever other denominations, the tools to understand this tradition as closely from the inside as possible.
When you say socialize, you're still socializing the student and orienting them to the past, because a lot of the content that's taught at NELC is not necessarily engaging like the current moment, right? It seems like some of the courses end somewhere around like Muhammad Abdul, and so I'm wondering, do you engage thinkers in the current Islamic world? Do you, not so much that you're teaching students right from wrong, but you're socializing them into the present context of what Islam looks like today?
Yeah, I mean, not really. We do have, modern historians, but they generally kind of, 80s is kind of the cut-off point even for, I mean, like, when we do survey courses, modern Islamic thought, I take that up until the, kind of the Arab Spring, maybe even a little bit after the Arab Spring. But it's not like current affairs. There are obviously, modern thinkers that one can engage or could engage, and that also comes in, can come in, but it's not the focus of my teaching and of my research, and not of anyone in my department at the moment. We do have modern Arabic literature, but not modern Islamic thought.
I would add this, on the question of constructive work that's done within religious studies. If you were to take a seminar with me at the Divinity School, and we're studying, let's say, a text, it would be often an advanced text, probably in a manuscript, that requires philological expertise and or the ability to handle just the basic terms and so on. And also the goal is to be able to just inhabit a thought world for 9 weeks, really understand the priorities of an author, and try to then be able to contextualize that in that author's world. I don't make the move from that to then, what does that mean for me right now in 2023 as a Muslim at the Divinity School? If I wanted to do that kind of work, I could offer, let's say, a course on Asherism, mainstream Islamic theology, one of the mainstream schools of Islamic theology, and like literature on subatomic physics or something, and try to see how to process new discoveries in science, or let's say in astrophysics. I know a lot about Sufi cosmology in the 12th century. How would that then translate into contemporary breakthroughs in our understanding of the structure of the universe or something? I do not do that work, but if I were to try to do something constructive, I would probably work in that direction, which would mean really being in conversation with people in other departments to make sure that I understand what those scientific breakthroughs may be and how then they may redefine my understanding of mulk, malakut, and jabarut or something, or the physical sensory world, the spiritual world, and the world of attributes and invincibility. I think constructive work done at the Divinity School does that kind of work to a certain extent. The trend has been to get rid of metaphysics, actually, and try to think of a thought world without metaphysics. So focusing on revelation, what it means, the revelatory events, that kind of thing.
Kind of go back to the distinction between a university setting and a madrasa setting, which is completely different, right? I mean, many of the materials are the same, but the mission is different, the audience is different, the function and role is different. So the idea is not to teach a particular, and then the other issue here, and I'm going to come back to my first point in a minute, but is the various different kinds of Islam, right? So if a student comes, what kind of Islam? There are so many different theological schools, different ways of practicing Islam. And that's not my role, or Ahmed's role, or Yousef's role, or anybody's role here to teach you how to be a good Muslim, really, in a university setting. As a university professor and a scholar, our roles are to give you, as you said, the tools, and to give you kind of the fabric and the historical background, the various players, the various texts, and then let, if the students' kind of motivation in studying this particular text or taking this particular class is to become a better Muslim or to learn about their religion, they can do so, right? They get the tools, they learn the language better, they learn how to access the textual tradition better. So each to his own. We're not teaching them how to live their lives, but we're giving them the tools and teaching them what's, the historical, as the texts and the players and the developments.
So from the academic vantage point, you're giving them the tools for the purpose of what? They're being educated for a purpose. I mean, there is a reason why the curriculum is designed in a certain way.
Actually, that's a really, really important question. There are two answers to that. So one is the answer that most academics, I think, would give is it's like, knowledge is good, right? Any kind of knowledge and rationality and information and cultural understanding, all of those things are good. It makes you a better human being. It helps you understand the people around you, your society, and others, all of these things. It's innately a good thing. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. And then I think I'm also actually, and this is something that other academics may or may not have thought about, but I feel very strongly about, is that I do advocate for education for a purpose, which purpose is to become better human beings. So, I introduced you to this Hyde Park Institute colleagues, right? So the idea is how to, we want to become better human beings. And so it shouldn't be only about learning skills. We should think it's about learning skills and about getting knowledge, but how do we become better people by in the process, right? So for me, that's important. And I don't know what the answer is. I think there are many ways in which this can be done, but it's for example, I am part of I'm co-director of my father's educational foundation in India, and we have run some, and we hope to continue to run some more conferences on what we call taqrib. So bringing people together, not within Muslim denominations, but also in India, for example, with Hindus, with other kinds of philosophies, The idea is to kind of promote the study of exemplars of harmony versus aggrandize people who, kind of brought dissension and disunity among people. So you need to be aware of all these things as well, but it's important to kind of also focus really on kind of studying these kinds of things that bring people together, which are present in all traditions. So what do we focus on? We should be learning, we should be open to studying and kind of examining everything, you know, people who disunited as well as people who united, but I think we should be conscious of what we're doing. I think we should not kind of live in a space where we think, okay, this has nothing to do with the outside world. I think it has everything to do with the outside world. So in this aspect, as in many other aspects, I think we should all be conscious of what it means to, you know, write something or say something or take a particular position in something.
Mm-hmm. So this part about being a better human being, is that part of the humanities mission, or is this just something based on, you know, each individual professor's perspective?
I mean, culture is a constant work. Right? I mean, you know, Shakespeare is still like a bestseller, but it's a bestseller because you have to buy it in school. If that wasn't the case, people wouldn't. Like, oh wow, this is amazingly incomprehensible text. I need to read this. You know, you have to acquire the tools to appreciate it. Right. And similarly, I mean, the same. I mean, the meaning of a research university that teaches and researches is to maintain. You know, you might call me elitist in that sense, but maintain a high culture. Right? You need to. You can't just say, okay, well, whatever. Even I grew up knowing Arabic. That still doesn't enable you to, for example, appreciate al-Mutanabbi. You still have to. You have to learn to appreciate it, and this work, somebody has to do it. It doesn't do itself. You know, it's not, you know, funny cat videos. You don't need any kind of, you know, education to appreciate that. But you need an education to appreciate and be able to continue high culture. Mm-hmm. And what are the institutions that do this? And the university is, in my opinion, the main venue these days to continue this and continue enabling people to read a text and say, oh, this is not just some funny person from the 14th century who wore a turban who had funny ideas, but no, just look at this and actually read it together and realize that this is actually, this contains profound clues to understanding even your own situation and just recognizing how we live in a world that is you know, inheriting ideas of the past and is constructed by idea of the past. Even sitting in the American Midwest, that ideas of the past. I mean, one thing I like to teach in my classes is how you know, American political thought of the 20th century is influenced by the reading of Islamic philosophy directly. Right? That these people who are influential in formulating American political philosophy read Muslim philosophers, and so the ever presence of these figures, and you know, enabling our students to, you know, be able to read these texts, and you know, once such traditions die, it's incredibly difficult to recapture this. So there has to be, you know, like languages, you know, once a language dies out, it's very difficult to, and you can never quite recover it. Right? You might be able to rediscover what the script means, but you don't know how it sounded, for example. You know, and similarly, like cultures, intellectual traditions, religious traditions, you need to maintain an understanding what it mean of what they mean in order to, you know, to carry this forward into the future.
So it takes an enormous amount of work to appreciate this high culture, right? Let's say a 14th century advanced text of Arabic literature or Persian poetry or something like that. That process of training that we're involved in, we ourselves as faculty are constantly trying to improve our own skills, but also mentor others who are trying to acquire them, so that when we come together in a seminar, we can appreciate, even if it's 6 people around the table, we can appreciate an advanced text of Islamic thought or literature, Arabic literature or something. That process of acquiring the skills and then beginning to appreciate some advanced text actually also results in the creation of another text. Right? And we then go about writing about what we drew from our training and our reading of these texts. And I mean, our own conversation now is a sort of a text that's constructive. We're trying to be reflexive and deliberate about what we're doing. Perhaps we don't do it often enough. But at the Divinity School, for instance, where it's like a blend of religious studies / ministry studies and other approaches, there is a history of let's say, non-ordained Christian thinkers teaching Aristotle. And they're very good at teaching Aristotle, but they're also Thomists, let's say. And they will teach a class on the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but they may also write a book about Aquinas in the contemporary period. And that book would be appreciated and assessed by colleagues who have similar kinds of training and so on. So, I mean, in a sense, we're all doing constructive work. In a sense, some do it and others prefer to perhaps do analytical work. I don't know how else to classify it, but.
So I was once the convert grad student trying to learn about my religion partly through the academy, and the way that I did it, my field was media studies, so I wasn't in Islamic studies, and I kind of engaged with Islamic studies at a distance and on my own terms, which at the time I think had certain advantages for me, but also left a lot of gaps that I've tried to fill in over the years. But when you look at those students who are coming in, as you mentioned, and they're saying, I'm looking for something, I'm not finding it here, where do I find it? I think there's often a sense of a necessary opposition between the academy and kind of the religious experience or the religious tradition, say. Maybe that necessary opposition is encapsulated in terms like Orientalism or secularism that are just seen to be in sort of absolute conflict, and that the student has to position themselves in a necessarily defensive stance, which I see now as an administrator and students coming to the MA program. I often see them sort of in that mode, that I'm here to kind of learn what they think about us and learn how to defend against them. And it's not a very, it's understandable that there are sort of maybe hostilities in the mix or tensions in the mix, but it's not a really constructive way for the students to approach it. So how do you deal with like that kind of encounter, and how do you get students who are coming in? I'm sure you would recognize that phenomenon. How do you get students to kind of recognize that there is a more complex engagement that doesn't have to be understood through this kind of framework of necessary opposition?
Let's say you're teaching a class on hadith, and you have a student who walks in and says, I'd like to write a paper about how this particular hadith nourishes me as a person, or what it means for me in my life. That obviously would be, a case where a student really wants perhaps to write just a purely confessional paper, let's say about their insights into a hadith based on what variables inform their background and their life and what it means to them. What I would probably do in that kind of case, and I think it would work at the Divinity School and at NELC, is I would try to first identify a pocket of secondary academic literature that's relevant to that student. For instance, if the student is shaped by a learning disability that really impacts how they read, and they're struck by a hadith that resonates with them because it somehow addresses that issue, then I would say, your paper, you can write it about like this particular hadith in conversation with your life, but you have to put it in conversation with academic literature on learning disabilities and see how that relates to this particular hadith, to kind of triangulate it. Because the point is that we're trying to train students to engage in a scholarly conversation. And it's not just, let's say a purely religious reflection or a religious sermon or a khutbah or something. I do believe that there is a distinction between confessional work and academic work. I don't adhere to insider versus outsider understandings of how the religious traditions can be studied. I don't believe insiders have less or more of an advantage in studying a religious tradition than outsiders. But I do believe that it's important to if one wants to be part of an academic conversation and have that academic conversation bear upon one's life, to be able to relate it to an ongoing academic secondary field of scholarship. And so there is a way for a student to really work through their own internal, let's say, personal quest, but still have a space within the university. And I think in any department, as long as they can identify relevant secondary literature to engage. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what my colleagues how they'd respond to that.
I think, so kind of on the flip side of that, I think as people who are, all of us are very interested in pre-modern materials, we take it for granted that they're important and they're relevant and they actually are vitally important to who we are today and how we operate today. But that's not necessarily how everybody feels, especially undergraduate students. So I think kind of bringing that relevance to the fore is important, and there are different ways to do it. So for example, in my classes, depends on the kind of class too. So even though I'm teaching, Islamic thought and lit 600 to 950 AD, it's an early period course, but in the presentations that I assign, I say, A, B, C. So the C is when you do a group report, the C part should be how, your study of the hammam in Cairo in the 10th century kind of connects to the present time. So in whatever way you think it connects, right? So it gets them to think about the connections, and there is a connection, and there is a relevance to their present day way of being and mode of being, and how things are happening in the world, in the Middle East, but also everywhere in the world. So there's a way to do it. I think in terms of writing papers, the important thing is to, when you, even if the topic should be important to you and speak to you for any kind of paper that you do, right? It shouldn't be just an exercise that has absolutely no relevance, but it must be within the parameters of the class. And it should be evidence-based and connected and speaking to the secondary literature. So it's an academic exercise. There's a difference in the kinds of things one writes. If you're writing an academic analytical paper, it has to have those parameters in place. If it's an essay, as in a personal kind of take on something, that's a different thing, and that's not the skill we're teaching for a particular assessment. So it depends, right? So what you're trying to do and what you're trying to teach them and what the parameters of the class are. And going back very quickly, if I may, to an earlier point that was raised about NELC not having someone who does immediate modern, working on thinkers in the Middle East. I think it would be great to have someone who does that, right? It would be wonderful. But the thing is, the fact that we have such a large department as it is, with so many faculty doing so many different things, is a huge luxury in the West, right? It's one of the maybe, 10 places in the US where we have such a kind of strong number of faculty doing various things Islamic. It would be wonderful to get, I think, if someone can fund it, a chair in that would be absolutely fantastic. But we have so many lacunae also. That we would love to have, right? So it's not that we're not wanting to do this and not offer this. It's just, it takes money and funding and a lot of interest from the community maybe as well, but also from the university department. So if you were in the Middle East and in a you would have, in a department, you would have, 5 scholars working on Ghazali, or 5 scholars working on Mutanabbi in one department. Here, I'm all of the Arabic literature from 600 to 1800, and Ahmed is all of Islamic thought from the same period. So, and maybe even going forward into the present time. So, I think it's important to appreciate what we have, as well as kind of lament the lacunae. It's important to identify the lacunae because hopefully we can get moved in those directions as well. But I don't think it's vital to have someone in the present time versus the pre-modern. I think the pre-modern is equally vital, if not more, because it really informs who we are today, and that drives all the thinkers in the Middle East today as well. Anyway, I'm going from here to here, and I'll stop.
I understand that there's limitations with resources, and that's absolutely valid in every institution. But the question becomes, you know, the way that Islamic studies is taught currently, kind of as a reflective exercise, like what does that do when we're always focused on historical Islam or, you know, textual Islam or, you know, something that's not really fully engaging the present moment? What is that doing for the understanding of Islam today? Because whether we're intending it or not, something is happening, right? So if you're constantly, you know, focused on teaching Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, and all this is very interesting and intriguing, and you know, the knowledge is intense, and you need a lot of training and tools to be able, I mean, to read Ibn Arabi and understand him, right? But again, what is it doing? And I think, you know, whether at the academic university level or at a seminary level, which is also takes a similar focus, I would say, then what is that doing for the understanding of Islam?
But see, Dina, the nice thing is that at the University of Chicago, we do have people who do present-day Islam, right? It's just, you just have to go to a different department. You go to the Anthro department, and Hossein Agrama does that, and other people do that. In the Divinity School, Ali Reza Dustar does that. Right. And so there are people, it's just not, NELC is more focused on pre-modern stuff. We do have some modern things too, and we would love to get, you know, someone who does the history of modern Iran, for example, which we don't have. But you can only have so many things. And if you're asking what does it say, I mean, it's the thing is you do have the option as a student, you can go to these various other departments and study these various other moments and the present moment as well. And that you can do, you know, here we don't have everything or all kinds of things, but, you know, it's just...
I would say we have pockets of strength.
Yeah.
And those pockets of strength in various departments are a result of our history, our resources, and the practical strategy in that kind of context is to capitalize on what we have and try to avoid becoming overly insular. But at the same time, you know, there's a certain set of themes, topics, approaches, and so on that we're known for because of those strengths that we have, and our culture is somewhat defined by that. And the challenge is to always be open to other possible methodological approaches without spreading ourselves too thin. One challenge I have is really to be able to be coherent to a non-academic. I really believe that a good scholar can give a lecture at a place like Oxford and you know, at a high academic level, but also make sense to non-academics in the markets of Cairo. And you know, if I just make sense to myself and another group of clones, and I make less and less sense to more and more people as I advance in my research, I think there's something imbalanced. And to your point, Tahera, about like the intersecting with other conversations is for me the way out of that insularity, which can be rewarded at the University of Chicago, especially, where you're rewarded for writing very, very specialized works, and then you're no longer in conversation with other fields. So in coursework is where we tend to branch out a bit. In my experience, right? Let's say next year I'm teaching a class on dreams, and because I find myself now at a point where I'm really conversant in a few strands of Islamic thought, and it takes a decade to just start like becoming conversant in those strands. But instead of just teaching about those strands within Islamic thought, I can bring them to bear on dreams. Everybody dreams. How do Sufis make sense of dreams? How do theologians interpret dreams? And suddenly I find myself stretched a bit, but within my comfort zone. Still, I'm within my area of expertise, and others are interested in what I have to say. I do that as a course first, and then maybe it turns into a written project later on. But again, there's a pocket of strength, right, that my presence or presence of colleagues have, and then intersecting it with other conversations through coursework, and then somehow there's a trickle effect into writing. But immediate impact is not something I look for. A book outlives its author, and I'm at peace with the fact that maybe insights I may be generating now will only speak to people later, or beyond my terrestrial life.
There is a dominant narrative, and that dominant narrative is institutionalized Islam. So it's a very different narrative than, let's say, if you looked only at like the origins of Islam and tried to, through certain academic methodologies, reach an understanding of something, versus the outcome of research if you have to go through centuries of history to answer the same question. And so what I'm saying is, what does it do to engage only that long road to an answer versus also having another way of engaging directly with just that, the origins of Islam narrative. So it's, Quran, Hadith, just primary sources, let's say, to be able to do your research. Because a big part of, at least my understanding, and I don't know the case with PhD, but at least with master's students, is there's a requirement that you have to engage with secondary resources. You can't just write a paper based on primary sources only. Right. And so by virtue of that, you are, forcing a certain dominant narrative that Islam is institutionalized in a certain way, and that you have to go through this certain line to come to it to answer a certain question.
Let's say you go into economics and you're interested in the origins of inequality or of how inequality can be solved. You can't just say, I'm just going to write about this, because most of the time you're going to make a fool of yourself because people have already thought about this or whatever. You have to master what people before you have said about it and thought about this. And thereby then, once you get to the point when you have your own opinion, then you are participating in a conversation. You're not just opening the window and shouting out of the window. You have to engage with others what they have said before for it to also make sense. Of course, that does, there is a certain kind of limiting effect on you, and sometimes people never get beyond just regurgitating what people before them have said. But in terms of, academia as, kind of becoming part of an academic discipline is becoming part of a conversation. The ones that happened before you, so the people who have died and who said something about it, and we receive what they said, and the people who are engaged in it at the moment, and you are adding your voice. But you can only add your voice if you've listened to them first, and because you need to know what their vocabulary is, what the precedents in their opinions are, and then it becomes a conversation rather than just individual utterances in the room.
Mm-hmm. I would add, that yes, it's a collective tradition, really. It's a collective conversation with a life of its own, and we're like little parts of that conversation that precedes us and will live on after us. And one can be part of it without even having a formal university affiliation. One just has to read the same literature and engage it, assess it, and have a voice therein. And there are many independent scholars who are not socialized into the culture of a particular department, who are interested in certain themes, who read, you could say, works within secondary and primary literature, and contribute actively to these conversations. An example of a non-collective academic conversation and that is ongoing. To a certain extent, I can't generalize totally, of course, but contemporary Arabic scholarship, for instance, on, let's say, the Quran, or on North African intellectual history, coming out of Arabic universities. They don't, like dissertations written often, let's say in Rabat, are not always engaged with ongoing literature on their topics. For instance, Ghazali's books. Ghazali is a great Persian theologian of the 12th century. His books are now very important and celebrated and were very contested at the time. And they were burnt in Al-Andalus. The reason why some scholars were pushing for Ghazali's books to be burnt is a big debate in the academy. How and why and what political, intellectual, scholarly, social circumstances led to that moment. Works in contemporary Arabic scholarship that deal with that are not quoting the existing literature, are really outdated, even though they're coming out in 2020s, 2021, because they're not reading relevant secondary scholarship. And if you go to the back of those dissertations or of those published books, you see that there haven't, the bibliographies are not engaged in that literature, and it's poor quality as a result, because they're literally regurgitating assumptions that we've already deconstructed and refined by, let's say, in the early 1920s by Goldziher, and sort of very 100-year-old theses are still being published or they're passing as dissertations in a context where you don't have a collective conversation. The danger is socializing, becoming too limited, becoming so formed by the academic world that you can't possibly creatively think outside of it.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, so when publishers kind of think about dissertation versus books, one of the things that is immediately on the table is voice. So, the author's voice should come through strongly. And dissertations often are much more tentative about that. They kind of want to have literature reviews and cite everybody, and kind of are more timid about expressing the. So, but the point is that when do you express your voice really strongly? You do it well when you actually are aware of all of the stuff that's written, even if you're not citing everybody right and left, right? You need to be aware of what people have thought and said about a certain topic, and what the ideas that have already been kind of developed are, in order to kind of then use them and kind of take them forward. You can disagree with certain things, you can agree with certain things. It's not so black, it's a very complex and very sophisticated process, actually, to kind of take an idea forward in your own words. So we're all in this together to kind of understand things better and keep refining and keep moving the envelope forward. So just as in the sciences you would make a discovery, I think most people don't understand what it is to actually be a scholar in the humanities. Mm-hmm. What do you do, right? What do you spend your day doing? You teach only 2 classes a term? What do you? And that's what my father-in-law would ask, so what do you do all day? So it's about thinking about ideas, right? So we're producing knowledge in a way. Not to sound too high, whatever. But we're trying. That's what we're trying to do. The aspiration is to kind of understand things and understand things better, and kind of push the envelope forward. It's like making a new discovery in the sciences, right? When you write a new book which has different ideas, but there can be lots and lots of different kinds of books most of the books that are written in the Middle East, but also in the Western world, often don't push the envelope further. They just kind of they as you say, they regurgitate the same old. Mm-hmm. They don't do. So the idea is to kind of engage in a conversation, have ideas with evidence, kind of present your ideas and move the envelope forward as much as you can.
Yeah. No, you've made it very clear about the value of the research for the academic community and what that does for the academic understanding of Islam. What I'm wondering about is what's the relevance or role of the academy for the public? And what is it, for example, being situated in Hyde Park for, let's say, an African-American Muslim on the South Side?
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I'm sure all of us have thoughts about this, because I think it's important to so producing knowledge is kind of the what we do as academics. That's what we are rewarded on for tenure and so on. But also that's why we entered the field. We want to understand things. We want to kind of understand new things. We want to dig into our books and kind of figure out how things worked. There is obviously a difference in terms of, expression in terms of what speaks to an academic audience versus what speaks or what is interesting for and kind of relevant to a non-academic audience. And I think it's very important to kind of make that bridge. The thing is, not everybody has to do everything, right? So some of us may write in both and speak in both venues, and some of us may just speak in our specialization in the very academic kind of world that we live in. And it's up to others to kind of take the knowledge we produce, and then, we have Karen Armstrongs of the world who kind of take what people have written and then write it in a very clear, beautiful way for the public. But they're drawing on findings made by scholars of Islamic history. They're not producing their own knowledge. So people have different roles in all of this. An academic can't be everything to everybody, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have the time to produce the knowledge. So it's just, but it depends. There are different kinds of people, and some people kind of sit in both seats beautifully as well.
Yeah, I guess my question, though, is as the research is happening, is there that thought or that internal conversation of what I'm doing now, what does that actually do for the experiences of Muslims, living today, or the understanding of Islam today? Because, and some people would look to the academy, for example, to perhaps define problematic terms or revisit terms. So, the whole idea of like Islamicate coming out of the University of Chicago and, trying to separate, the culture from the religion was an important conversation. I don't know how much traction it has in spaces outside of University of Chicago. But there's definitely, like people are looking to the university to say, if a term like, and I'll just use an example, like Islamic terrorism is used, Islamic terrorism is used in an academic conversation on a panel, or is not identified as having ramifications on the ground, then, what is the role of the academy in terms of serving the understanding of Islam?
At the Divinity School, we have the Mark and Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. And the goal there is really to support specialists in various fields to have public-facing events often. So one could, for instance, and there have been events at the Marty Center, for instance, where we bring experts in what's now called Islamic spiritual psychology, bringing in, let's say, leaders in the field, psychiatrists and so on, mental health practitioners from Khalil Center, from across North America, to talk with intellectual historians of Avicennan doctrines of the soul, for instance, and have a cross-pollination there. And it is public-facing. It's intended for a broader audience, and we have things like Spotlight, which is just a public-facing journal. Of course, CMES does some of this work as well. But it's optional. It's not a priority for someone who's, let's say, pre-tenure and who's just establishing their academic record. But for someone who's at a senior stage in their career and wants to serve the field, for instance, and they've said what they want to say, that's often a very good project for that stage in their career, should they choose to do that, to serve the field, to become more of a public intellectual. And that takes a whole other set of skills that we don't necessarily acquire as we're teaching in seminars or earning our PhDs or working up for tenure. And the authorial voice that you mentioned, Tahera, is evolving, and it's timid at first, and then it grows into sort of a phase of maturity as awareness of the literature sort of cements. And then at some point, some scholars choose to do that kind of service-oriented work. and it's, I think for me, it's a question of the right project at the right stage in one's career. And there's a time for everything. But the beautiful thing is that this is one of the last few places in the modern world where we can slow things down and have a deliberate culture and just really take it slowly and think carefully about what we're trying to say. And that should be protected and cherished. And the immediate impact of that may not be very tangible, but there is, of course, a trickle down or some kind of center to periphery effect that takes place. And proof of that is in the fact that so many academic conversations become popular, translate into popular terms and themes and tropes. So it's something to protect and cherish, but also, yes, the insularity can be, a reality in that kind of context. And Marty Center is there, at least in the Divinity, at the Divinity School, to help us avoid that and engage a bit more the public. We have lunches with religious leaders in the South Side. We work with Iman and other organizations in South Side Chicago.
Yeah. And in terms in your specific example of the word Islamic terrorism, I think it's the duty of all academics to speak out against these biased terms, right? So whenever we get an opportunity, we should, depending on what your life is and your persona is in terms of your academic teaching. So for many of us, that would be in our classrooms, where we kind of promote a very nuanced understanding of Islam, and kind of point out why these terms are biased and not true to the reality and so on. For others who, there are certain academics who are called on by the media and who kind of cultivate that persona. And so for them, it's absolutely a responsibility to do that. I remember I was in Paris once being invited for a UNESCO conference, and a journalist asked me in French, no less, and so this was a very difficult conversation for me to have, something about the something quote-unquote Islamic State, meaning ISIS. And I said, you're a journalist, you can't call it the Islamic State. You're promoting, their agenda. You're helping their agenda by this nomenclature. Just change it. I can say it 20 times, but I'm going to say it to 30 students. You're speaking to the world. It's the media actually here who has much more power and influence. It's not that academics can't influence, but it just depends what kind of academic you are. If you're an academic who's consistently called on by CNN or someone as their consultant, then you obviously have a much larger viewership. But for someone who's writing about, 10th century Islamic thought or 10th century Islamic Arabic literature, depending on how many people are going to read you, it's a different thing, right? Mm-hmm. But again, all of us have a responsibility to kind of be aware and to and that's just good scholarship anyway.
Ala fikra, how do you refer to that group then?
Daesh.
ISIS. Daesh, yeah.
But the Islamic is in there. I mean, the Islamic is hiding in there, no?
Well, at least you're not saying it, right? You can make up another name for them, but the issue is now this is the same issue with the Islamic thing, Hudsonian Islamic. It's like it has to catch, and it has to be something that people understand. But at the same time, you have to refuse to say Islamic State. I refuse to say Islamic State. Even if the journalist asks me 10 times to say it, I will say it's like, you can't say that. Versus just answer her question, I don't have a great answer for, how would you call them, because you have to be able to identify them. People have to understand who you're talking about. But IS is better than...
An example of a way an academic would address that question, like not just in front of a mic or to a journalist, would be perhaps to write a paper about the history of the term terrorist, and then its association with Islamic terrorist, and probably even suggest a way, an alternative, and publish it in an academic journal on contemporary Islamic thought, and then maybe engage CMES, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, or the Marty Center in a conference to bring publicly impactful intellectuals and scholars to to talk about that and then summarize it for an audience in Spotlight.
It's important to think about terms and translations and how we render certain things and how we render certain narratives and whether we use normative ways, and again, transitioning into a slightly different thing, but also connected. I was at a conference on reevaluating methodologies at the University of Toronto just a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I sort of deliberately but hesitantly chose a rather controversial title. So my title is Nahjul Balagha, a Shi'i book, and the subtitle was Insidious Labels and Academia's Myth of Objectivity. I mean, I hope it's a very carefully argued paper, but the idea is that when you use labels as Shi'i, for example, for Nahjul Balagha, which should not be, it's certainly dear to the Shia, but should be, or it is and was equally precious to the Sunnis, except for a certain group of Ibn Taymiyyah kind of group. It's a very small group, right? So it's important to think of labels and terms and how one presents history and how one presents Islam. And diversity and openness should kind of be our catchwords here. So when we present, we say, well, according to the Shia X, according to the Sunnis Y, versus saying, this is what happened, right? Instead of saying, and Muhammad died without appointing an heir, and the Madinans chose Abu Bakr. Well, that is certainly correct according to the Sunni view, but you should say it that way, versus saying normatively that's what happened. I'm kind of moving from one to another, but I think all of this has to do with assumptions and kind of innate kind of underpinnings and so on.
Just to kind of throw in some nuance, it also really depends on the context, right? I mean, I think it's important one doesn't establish some sort of, that you don't establish kind of unreflective taboos. Or you can't say this. You can't say. You can't put Islam and something negative. You can't say this. If there's somebody in political science who runs a database about terrorist organization, how do you categorize ISIS? It's a terrorist organization. It's not about socialism. It's like it's not unreasonable to have a category of Islamic terrorism, Sunni terrorism, Shiite terrorism for categorization. For the sake of categorization in political science, as long as it is clear what you're talking about, right? As long as these don't become simplistic, simplistic stereotypes in people's minds.
But they do, and they are. So
what do you call ISIS then?
I mean, so that's a roundtable discussion,
but
right?
as a phenomenon, you study terrorist organizations. You have terrorist organizations that talk about, economic problems. How does ISIS present itself?
You have to. So there are two things. One, I think you have to at least be thoughtful about how you classify, and not just use anything, and think of the implications. And then if you are going to use a term like Islam, a religious term, to terrorism, then you have to apply it across the board, right? Which is not done. That's the other problem, consistency. So whenever you think of religion / terrorists, religion adjective terrorist, you're mostly going to say Islamic terrorists. You're not going to see other religions and terrorists, even though there are lots of people in the world who do terrorist activities, drawing on justifications from religious traditions, different religious traditions than Islam, in so many parts of the world. So it's the fairness, and from where I stand, I think it's just Islamic terrorism is just a no. You can't say, you can't put the two things together. Islamic violence, I think violence is, you're kind of perpetuating the myths and the stereotypes. So we think that because we're talking as academics, it's okay to just tell it as it is, but it's not as it is, and I think we have to be responsible and think of the ramifications and the stereotypes.
But on the other hand, if you want to take, let's say you studied ISIS. None of us does. I wouldn't motivate me getting out of bed in the morning to study ISIS, but you have to take seriously. You have to a certain degree, take seriously what they say about themselves. Some people say, oh yeah, At the bottom, it's about independence or revolt against the American occupation of Iraq, which it might be at the bottom of it, but that's not what they say.
Yeah.
And so the kind of classification in terms of what is their political program, if you read their one-page political program, what do they say is their program?
Yeah.
And you, in a sense, you have to take them seriously. That doesn't mean, of course, in a serious engagement, you also have to make clear that these are obviously all minority phenomena. The same way that when you say male violence, you don't mean that that normally men are violent or whatever. But so what are you going to you have to just be silent on it, or what do you actually, like people whose job it is to deal with this? What do I tell them? They come to me and say, okay, I studied this, so what shall I say then? Like, how do I write about this?
But if you're taking them seriously, then you wouldn't call them terrorists, right? Because they don't identify as such.
Yeah, okay. The point is not necessarily that you have to call them terrorists, but I thought the point in under discussion was the term Islamic, and if you call them an Islamic group, Islamic militant group, I don't know, but as I say, it's not a the work of qualification of classification is difficult, and you have to obviously contextualize it, but these are constant things one has to struggle with,
right.
and all the terms, what you mentioned before, Islamicate, they are all kind of leaky cauldrons, right? There's no okay, this is the ideal way of phrasing it, etc. But depending on the context, one has to use terms that that clarify more than they hide.
Yes, yes, and I think that's really the key point, to make sure the terms are clarifying instead of misconstruing further. Concepts that might be more confusing to somebody if they're not understanding, how the Islamic and the terrorist concepts meet.
So I think, although it's hard to find a term, I think we have to find a term that kind of conveys who we're talking about to everybody. I think we're all on the same page here. I think we're just trying to think of different
Yeah, I think
ways
it's important. We use this example to just highlight the idea that, these discussions are brilliant, that they're happening, and both sides are very much aware of the implications, and it's really coming up with, what is the best term for it. So I see this more as a thinking together, and that's really what the public potentially is looking to academics to engage in more, is these kinds of debates of what is the most useful, what elucidates a term further, and so on and so forth.
I think of a classroom primarily as a kind of safe space, not in the way sometimes it's used, but safe in the sense of, this is a place in which there are no second-class citizens based on any kind of identity or background that people have, whether it's not, being non-religious or religious or whatever, but that this is a space in which you have certain ground rules of argumentation that apply to everybody, and in which on that playing field, we interact obviously with a certain type of mutual respect, but also kind of arguing and seeking truth, and which also involves kind of arguments back and forth and disagreement. So I think it's there is, and we talked about this before, that historically speaking, any kind of discussion that excludes certain kind of members turns in a certain way, right? If you have a discussion just among men about women, or just among women about men, you leave out something, right? You more likely kind of veer into stereotypes or whatever. And I think the study of Islam that is only carried out by non-Muslims, or that is only carried out by Muslims, has inherently kind of danger of kind of excluding viewpoints, and therefore I think it's actually very important that one has a variety of people in the classroom, and at the same time one that everybody learns how to interact with each other based on arguments rather than on kind of identity politics, whichever way it goes.
And I completely agree with that. And just on that same note, I mean, secularism has its own. I mean, if you kind of identify, I'm secular, it sort of brings in its own ideology in a way. So it's not that. The thing is, as I think that it's naive to think that anyone in the world is completely 100% objective in the, I mean, what we are striving for here, in my view, is to be honest, transparent, evidence-based, and open in terms of, and respectful in terms of inquiry. Everybody has their own background and their own whatever it is that they grew up with, not just religion, but just culture and all kinds of norms that people grow up with, and kind of all kinds of assumptions that people bring to the table without even realizing they're bringing those assumptions. So I think as long as we're all those adjectives that I just kind of listed, transparent, evidence-based, honest, and so on, I think that's good enough. That's the best we can be, right? So we're trying to reach a general rational truth here. And if, I was told once, and again, this is something very personal, but it's also very important to me as an academic. So a senior academic told me once, Tahera, you can't be a religious person in an academic setting. I said, well, I am. I am both. I'm a Muslim, and I'm not going to kind of pretend I'm not. And I'm also an academic, and I hope I'm, an open and evidence-based academic. And the thing is, my religion teaches me to be rational and to seek the truth. And so I don't want to separate them, because I see religion as teaching me to be open and seeking the truth in every which way, and in every kind of arena, really. So I think the issue with kind of positioning secularism as objectivist or objective kind of real academic work versus someone who's Muslim or someone who's belonging to any kind of religious denomination as being inherently biased, I think that's just a false dichotomy. I think we have to acknowledge that everybody brings backgrounds to the table. But that we should all be open and striving to understand the truth as much as we can understand it in a collective fashion.
So I'll end with one question. So maybe just taking you back in time a little bit, if you could think about the moment when you knew you would pursue Islamic studies, that was your interest, this is what you see yourself doing professionally. When was that? How did you know? And what were you hoping to add to the field? What was your highest aspiration? And we could start.
I was an English teacher in Marrakesh after I finished my bachelor's degree, and I enjoyed teaching English, but I found myself always teaching about Islamic thought in an English classroom. And I realized if there's a way I can combine teaching with reading about my religious tradition, I would pursue that, because I could teach and read. And lo and behold, I found myself applying to grad school, Islamic Studies, religious studies departments to study Islam as an academic and then be able to teach it in a classroom. That was my kind of teaching English is when I realized, yes, I like to teach and I like to read about Islam, and that was my moment.
Tahera?
Gosh, that's a simple question, but that's a really hard question. So two things. I grew up in India and I didn't know Arabic so I didn't speak Arabic at home. I spoke Gujarati and English. I learned in school. It was an English medium school. But I studied Arabic, learned how to read the Quran and kind of religious texts and so on. But, so as I was growing up, I always wanted to really understand what I was saying in my prayers. It's like when I'm reading the Quran, I'm really not understanding most of it. I want to know what it says. So that was kind of one of my drivers for then going to Cairo and learning Arabic, I also was always fascinated by literature and, you know, the wise words and maxims and aphorisms of Imam Ali, and I really wanted to kind of study them. So that was kind of my childhood. And I studied with my father. Then I went to Cairo, studied Arabic there. I never really actually thought this would become a career for me. Mm. Which is not, I mean, when as students come to me now, and it's like people who are applying to PhD programs, they know exactly, I mean, they're like thinking 20 years ahead. They was like, all right, if I do this subject, will I get a job? You know, it's like, I was actually not, growing up, that was not the environment I grew up in. So for me, it was just learning more and learning more and learning more, and just one thing led to another, and then finished, you know. Cairo was like, all right, you know what, I want to learn the methodology better. I want to get more training in kind of critical thinking, apply to the US, to Harvard. So it, you know, one thing led to another. Even when I was finishing my PhD, I was like, I'm not even sure now how I transitioned into actually the PhD becoming a career in teaching and becoming a professor and so on. But alhamdulillah, all good.
Yeah, well,
happy to look back.
It's a passion then. If you don't feel, you know, the transition, then that means that you're very passionate about what you're doing, which is great. Ahmed?
Isolate a single moment. It was just like in the fall of 2001, I read a series of articles on how a very early text, second century text, the Muwatta of Malik, how it was written. And I had read this text before. It's very strange. It is a very strange text. And the fact how this scholar, Gregor Schoeler, how he, by just looking at the text, how he could find out how it was written and how it was taught, and that it was partially, you know, orally, and so you, like the closeness you could get to the process. That's what convinced, you know, because I like to read Arabic text before that, but that's when I thought, okay, this is something you can do, and like that is something meaningful you could do, something interesting. But I never had an idea of me contributing to something or getting paid for this or something like this. That didn't. I guess that's it was a different time as well. But.
Well, as I said before, I mean, my field was media studies, and so I either represent the long arm of Islamic studies or the long arm of media studies, going and taking from your discipline. But really, I mean, my development in grad school kind of aligned with my exposure to and acceptance and growth as a sort of a young Muslim. So a lot of that was happening at the same time. So I was exposing myself to, I mean, my master's dissertation was actually about race and sports in American media. So it was really, it touched on maybe a bit of kind of Islam and the African American experience, but it really didn't touch on much of Islamic studies at all. And so really with my PhD program and focusing on kind of contemporary Muslim world and contemporary Muslim media, which is what I ended up writing about, forced me to engage these sort of multiple literatures. And I guess I always felt that there was a value in both lines of the experience that wasn't always recognized by the other. So sort of my growth as a Muslim and what that meant and sort of insight that offered wasn't always fully recognized within academic circles, and likewise the kind of academic analysis and the insight in contemporary life that it provided wasn't always, I think, fully respected in sort of Muslim community. And so I guess I tried to bridge that gap as best I could. So.
Well, thank you very much for coming to the first Seldon Forum. So it's a privilege to have all of you here today, and we look forward to remaining in touch. I know that Tahera is going to Oxford soon, so we will miss you here in Hyde Park, the University of Chicago, but we'll remain in touch. Thank you.